Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Today we're going to be talking about governance during a pandemic, how we can govern Microsoft Teams without compromising adoption. And this is a really interesting topic that lots of our customers have been asking us about over the last 6 months in particular, but also before the pandemic started to take impact upon our lives, is how can we actually make sure that activity within Teams is productive, that our staff can work effectively, but that we make sure that we don't expose ourselves to compliance risks, and that we are really focused on ensuring that our teams can be productive, that they have access to be able to do the things that they need to do without actually causing us problems or creating sprawl. So we've got a packed agenda today, a lot to cover in the next hour, but we're really keen to hear from you throughout the session. Before we get started, my name's Stephen Monk. I'm the CEO of Engage Squared, and I'm a developer by background, but I mostly talk to our customers these days about how Microsoft 365 fits within their ecosystem, both from a technology perspective and also how they actually empower their staff to work effectively and productively. I will first want to start off by giving a big thanks to everyone for joining us today. We've had heaps of interest in this topic, as I said, and I'm really grateful that you've taken the time to join us. Also, big special thank you to all of our customers who have joined, both current customers and we hope future customers, and also our friends from Microsoft and a number of our partners who have joined the session today. A couple of pieces of housekeeping. So we are going to record the session and we will send it out to you after. So if any of your colleagues were unable to join or other people that you've been discussing this with, please feel free to share it amongst your colleagues, and we hope that there is some good content that you can take and share and use in your governance planning. We're also really keen to hear from you during the session, so please do feel free to ask questions in the chat. We're also got a few survey questions that we'll be asking you to contribute to during the conversation, and we'll have the URL for that in the chat. We'll also have it up on the screen as we go through the session today. We've got a bit of time during the session today to answer questions, so please do feel free to ask questions throughout. We will try to get to them during the session, and we'll leave time at the end to answer questions as well. Before we get started, just a really quick introduction. We're Engage Squared, and we're Microsoft 365 specialists. We mostly work with large organisations to help them understand how Microsoft 365 can really drive digital productivity within their organisation. And that goes from everything from collaboration, working together, sharing documents, co-authoring, editing, sharing information and managing knowledge, all the way through to employee engagement, adoption and change management, and applications and productivity driven by applications. But this topic's really really central to our ethos today, that governance is really critical to ensuring that you can actually get the most out of Office 365, but it can't happen in isolation, and it can't be just a technology project. It really is important that we consider people elements into the conversation as well. We've helped more than 400,000 people start using Teams this year. That part of that's been driven by obviously moving to remote working and the pandemic. But even before that, we've been practicing in adoption and change management within the Microsoft 365 space for a really long time. And we've found that things have changed a little bit as a result of the pandemic. A lot of our customers have rolled out new technology really quickly. And it's really accelerated the capabilities that they've been willing to provide to their staff. But we found in the rush to roll out Teams, many of our customers have delayed conversations that they would normally have had earlier. Things in particular about governance, about security, about compliance, about retention, really critical elements that most of our customers would have probably thought about before launching new technology are starting to come into the picture right now. We, as I said, have really great technical knowledge and also experience in organisational change management. And it's really this blend of skills that you need when thinking about introducing governance on top of Teams. So before I get into too much more about Teams itself, I want to introduce Claudia, who is the head of our change and adoption practice, to take us in a little bit more about why we might introduce governance and how that might fit into the organisation.
Thanks, Stephen, and welcome everybody. Before I jump into talking a little bit about governance and what that means and why we include governance to support our technology, want to go with the first polling question. So keen to understand, what is your biggest Teams challenge? So if you open up a web browser, Chrome or whatever your preference is, and go to menti.com and use the code that's up on the screen right now to help answer that question. We will look at the results in a little while. Cool. So I want to start by talking about an analogy that I find really useful for thinking about and explaining governance. Really, when we think about governance, there are two parts to it. There's people, and then there's technology as well, of course. So when we think about governance in this way, I like to use the analogy of a bowling alley. So you can think of the guardrails on the sides as the rules and the configuration that you apply to your technology, setting the right policies and also the right security to that. The bowling balls in the middle are people's behavior. So they're the manual things that people will need to do or the rules that they'll need to learn to make our governance model really valuable. And the two work together to achieve a great outcome. In the case of bowling, that means getting a strike. So when we think about governance in this way, we're really making sure that we consider all of the different elements. So one thing before I kind of jump into what those elements would be is to mention right up front that you're probably not going to get it right from the very start. And that there is no catch-all solution when it comes to governance, and particularly when governing a platform like Microsoft Teams or even the broader Office 365 or Microsoft 365 suite. There's a lot of initial groundwork that you'll need to do on both the people and the technology side to understand what's right for you, and also ongoing work that you'll need to do to make sure it remains suitable to your changing circumstances. In today's session, we'll be sharing insights, what we're seeing with our customers, and also what we've learned ourselves to hopefully make it just that little bit easier for you to start the process of developing a valuable and robust governance model. So going back to those elements and thinking about why we govern, I want to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. A good governance model can be broken into three core components that you see on the screen. So 1, strategic objectives, 2, people management, and 3, IT management. Each component is as important as the next, and they really need to work in unison. So let's dive into what each of these components mean. So first, strategic objectives. Good governance is intrinsically linked to the strategic objectives and the goals of your business or your organization. That means that as our business objectives shift, so too should our governance and security models. One thing that every business has in common right now is that their objectives and priorities have shifted because of the pandemic, and they probably will continue to for some time as we flex our models to what the new normal looks like. A lot of businesses, including some of our clients, were naturally caught out by the pandemic, some more than others. And there's plenty of reasons for why they were caught out and why others weren't so caught out. But really, if we look at it, a lot of it can be boiled down to lack of good governance and a lack of understanding of where the business is heading from a strategic perspective, and also a bit of resistance to change. What we're seeing is that the knowledge-based organisations who were the most impacted by the sudden shift were the ones that were stuck in that BAU mindset, the type of organisations that have historically been really rigid in their business models and their receptiveness to change as well. The ones that have really embraced that mantra of, but we've always done it this way. I'm sure everyone on the call has heard that phrase before. So we govern to support our strategic objectives, to build flexibility and adaptability in a safe way that keeps us as a business moving forward. So second, people management. Good governance helps us be flexible and adaptable in a safe way. and it really shouldn't get in the way of people doing their jobs. And it should support technology's role in amplifying and enhancing the efforts of our people. Despite the challenges we're all facing at the moment, there's a lot of exciting innovation happening in all industries right now, and we're pretty lucky to help support that in the role that we play. A lot of exciting innovation, though, means a lot more collaboration, and a lot of collaboration means more data that's being created, more knowledge that's being produced every day. So in the short term, that bout of innovation that's happening right now might not be too much of an issue, but chances are a lot of you are on this call today because there are people in your organisation who are either unaware of their end of the governance bargain, or because they don't have the right knowledge and skills to be using technology like Microsoft Teams to its full extent to help support that innovation. So people management is about drilling down deeper. Once you have a picture of the strategic vision and the objectives that you're supporting, it's time to dive into what people need to know and what your people will need to do to adopt new technology and also the new behaviours that support that greater cause. The reason why this is so important is because you can't automate everything. There will always be some level of behaviour, some level of manual input, thinking back to that analogy I shared earlier about the bowling alley, that will contribute to good governance. A lot of you, or a lot of what you'll need to know to do here can be done through good change management in terms of good governance. We'll be talking about what that means in a little bit more detail later on in the session today. And lastly, IT management. So once you have the right business context and you understand what the needs of your people are, it's time to think about your IT infrastructure and how you're going to enable your workforce through really great technology. As we'll learn from Stephen in a moment, governance of teams doesn't happen in a vacuum. You'll need to think about IT management holistically, so including information management, security, remote access and beyond. Ironically, some teams, IT teams, can be just as change resistant as other parts of the business. I've firsthand have experienced that. Cloud technology, if we look at it in terms of how long it's been around, it's still a relatively new thing that IT teams need to manage. Much of our technology infrastructure is on-prem and has been managed in a certain way for a really long time. And over that time, a lot of businesses have created finely tuned processes and also resourcing models to support that. Many of our clients are in a hybrid environment at the moment, and the scales are just starting to tip towards more SaaS-based technology or more cloud-based technology than on-prem legacy systems. So naturally, that move towards more cloud technology will have knock-on effects to your existing processes and your resourcing models as well. So the challenge for IT is to, for lack of a better word, positively disrupt itself to manage these changes in a more efficient and flexible way. This includes investing more time and effort into change management. As you'll see throughout today's presentation, the number of tech changes is only going to continue to grow, particularly within the Microsoft 365 stack. But don't let that scare you. There are ways to manage this in a smart and efficient way, some of which we'll share with you today. So, questions to ask yourself when you're planning or when you're reviewing your existing governance model. First, why are we doing this? What do you want your staff to be able to do? What tools do they need to enable them to do that? And how are you going to measure business impact? Second, what activities do you need to control? So what standards and rules do you need to comply with? Where will we apply controls? How can we apply rules in an effective way? How are we going to manage the platform? So how are you going to launch? How are you going to implement changes after launch? How are you going to handle an evergreen environment that naturally comes with a cloud-based technology? And lastly, who is responsible? Who needs to be consulted? Those are the questions that you need to be thinking about to really create and really evaluate the effectiveness of your existing governance model, or when you're just starting out on the journey of creating a new governance model. I want to share now some common problems that we're seeing across our clients as a result of the pandemic. The first problem that we're seeing, or the first theme that we're seeing, is data security. So compliance teams being really worried about losing data, so they lock down conversations and data, which can result in productivity lost. Second is remote access. So being too slow to develop the right remote access needs. So for example, if you've got a setup where you can only access Teams via a VPN, that VPN crashes because it's not capable of adding so many people or kind of catering to so many people at the same time. That can result in, again, productivity loss and revenue lost as well. Also, the issue here is shadow IT becoming, supplement that access to something like Teams. The third theme that we're seeing is staff being unaware of best practices and also business rules. So a good example of this is people bringing bad behaviour into a platform like Teams. So too many notifications in Teams. For some organisations, this means that because people are so keen to use it, Teams is becoming just as distracting as email. And lastly, bad search. So again, this comes down to behaviour and lack of knowledge with our business rules, because the organisation hasn't effectively told people how to use the platform and what kind of naming conventions to put in place, what structures they should be putting in place. So it's creating a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration. Awesome. So let's have a look at the results now. Keen to see what your biggest Teams challenge is. So it looks like there's a bit of a mixed bag on the screen, but looks like there's the highest numbers are Teams isn't used in a consistent way across the business, and there aren't any controls in place, so it's open slather. Very interesting. Hopefully we can give you guys some tips to control that today. I'll hand over now. Oh, actually, before I hand over, next question that we'd like you to respond to, how mature is your governance approach? So again, if you go to menti.com and you type in the code on the screen, the second question should appear for you in a moment. I'll hand over now to Stephen. You're on mute, Steve.
Sorry, how about now? Great Teams control there. So great overview, thank you, Claudia. And interesting to see, most of the challenges that we see are a result of one of two things. Either not enough adoption and change management and training, no consistent governance applied to teams, or too much governance applied to teams so that people can't do the things that they need to do to be productive. I think that's come through very clearly in the results that you've shared with us, that most of you are suffering from the first one. Not enough training, not enough governance, and not enough training about the governance. So people are using Teams in a way that is inconsistent. They're maybe not getting the maximum benefit from Teams. I want to shift a little bit into talking about what you can actually do in Teams, because there's a huge array of different options that are available. But I think the first point before we get into the options is really important, that the governance that's appropriate for you will vary depending on what you need to do within your organisation. So there is no one size fits all. There's not even necessarily one single best practice, because different organisations have different regulations, different requirements that they need to meet and comply with. They have different organisational culture and they have different objectives that they want to achieve using a tool like Teams. So it's impossible to do technology and think about technology in complete isolation from that change strategy. And I think as I go through the slides here and talk about some of these governance options, think a little bit about how this applies within your organisation from a strategic perspective. What are we trying to achieve with Teams? And do we need to introduce the governance in this section, or do we need to do more training, change management, or education of our users? That said, Teams provides a huge array of different options for governance. I think it's important to note before we get too much into the detail that Teams is not an application by itself. And this means that the infrastructure that sits behind it is critically important when we think about compliance and governance. You can't just manage Teams in the Teams client and the Teams admin settings. We also need to consider how Office 365 sits as part of that and the various different aspects that are part of Office 365 and Office 365 groups. There's a huge array of team services that sit underneath this, including calling and virtual agents and a whole range of different things. Lots of stuff from Azure, including Azure Active Directory and how that plays into things. And then there's a whole infrastructure layer provided through the Skype engineering that controls things like call quality and networking and infrastructure side of things. So we can't just think about Teams in isolation. We absolutely need to think about the whole platform. When that comes to a governance perspective, there's a range of different areas that we need to know about. We need to care about Microsoft 365 and Azure Active Directory and the admin tools that are available there. We need to care about Office 365 group settings. We need to care about identity and access management, multi-factor authentication. We need to care about licensing. So that's all controlled on the Azure Active Directory side and the Microsoft 365 tenant settings. Then we've got the Teams controls and the admin tools that are available within Teams. Controls that are available for managing messaging, for managing meetings, for managing calling, for managing apps. And there's a huge array of different things that are available there across a wide range of different capabilities within Teams. And then finally, there's the compliance and security tools that are available in Teams, in Office 365, and the governance capabilities that sit behind the scenes across Microsoft 365. And these are enabled in the base level Microsoft 365, but also the advanced functions and features that are available, including advanced data governance and advanced security and compliance. And all of these different areas can be configured in different ways to achieve different business outcomes. So in the context of Teams governance, starting with your business outcomes and strategy, and then trying to map that across to the various different capabilities that are available across Microsoft 365 and Azure Active Directory, across Teams, the Teams admin tools, and then across the Microsoft 365 security and compliance tools. And these settings can be configured at different levels as well, to just confuse the picture even more. So at a team level, at an Office 365 groups level, and globally, or users, or particular teams or channels. So some of those, to try to decipher what that looks like, I've tried to pull out a few of the key things that you might like to introduce to try to apply governance across your tenant. Oh, there we go. So first, one of the things that we care about a lot when we think about governance for teams is controlling or managing who can create teams and making sure that they've got the right understanding of what that implies, what responsibilities they have, how they need to manage and care about what's happening within their team, what they need to restrict or not restrict in the sort of conversations and documents and discussions and activities that can happen within that team as part of your compliance obligations. There are some controls to restrict who can create teams, but we do need to be very careful about unwanted side effects. An interesting side effect of Microsoft 365 being a platform is that Microsoft have limited the configuration options that are available in Office 365. So you've really only got the ability to either stop group creation, set group creation to a specific set of users, or enable everybody to create groups. There's a very good reason why Microsoft's done it like this, because when you create a team, it creates all these associated services. It creates a SharePoint site, it creates a team, it creates a stream channel, it creates a planner board, it creates a wiki, can create a OneNote. And so all of these different services create various different artifacts within Office 365 to manage and to empower staff to do things. But if we were to block just Teams creation and still enable SharePoint creation, well, you can still get SharePoint sites and you can still create documents in SharePoint. If we were to enable Teams creation but not enable SharePoint, then people can get a SharePoint site by creating a team. So it really has to be a holistic picture. We don't have any sort of granularity here. The options are basically on, limited, or off, but not limited based on workload, only to a select number of users. So the problem of trying to restrict who can create teams is that if you implement this, it can really dent adoption and it can get in the way of people being able to use the capabilities of Office 365 to be productive in the sort of remote and hybrid working environments that we work in right now. So we really encourage organisations to think very carefully about how they manage this. And instead of stopping team creation, instead thinking about managing this through a number of alternate methods. That can be education, doing change management and training. It can be about using the audit features to monitor who has created groups, or automating that through Power Automate, so that you can reach out to group owners when they've created a group and ask them to agree, nominate another person to be a group owner, to agree to a particular group management approach, to have a variety of different additional things that they need to care about and consider. We have seen different models used at different organisations, and our customers sort of go one of two ways. One of the ways that we often see is through some sort of approach like this, where instead of having the out-of-the-box group creation process, we create an alternate group creation process that can be used by staff to get the right thing that they need at the right time. And we'll try to make it as simple as possible so that it is as easy to use as the out-of-the-box process. Something like this is tailored to provide a bit of an education piece as well. So we can actually turn off group creation, but we provide an alternate mechanism that is very simple to use and that guides staff through a process to understand what is the most appropriate type of thing that they can get to solve their particular need. And this is a good example from a customer which we've built where we actually ask staff a number of questions about what are they trying to do within the area that they want to create. Are they trying to work with a project team or a community practice or to solve a particular problem? And what sort of conversations and work do they want to do within that area? And it might be off the back of this that actually we create them a team, or maybe we suggest that they have a Yammer community instead, or perhaps they need a site on the intranet, or perhaps they need a SharePoint site where they can use and store their documents. So we ask questions about what sort of materials will be stored and what sort of work will be done there. And off the back of that, we then create a group. This can be really useful as well because then we can ask additional compliance questions like who else will manage the group so that we don't have a single person who is the owner of the group. The downside of this is it's not quite as built into Teams, all the other workloads, and you have to manage a custom process. So you have to make sure that the process fits your business model and you keep it up to date, and you've got a bit of additional IT governance that needs to be applied on top of that. So an alternate approach to this is that we can use workflow, and we can do this reactively after a team is created. We can automate almost this whole process using Power Automate. So in this example, we allow the out-of-the-box process, and we allow people to create a team through the Teams interface, or create a Yammer group through the Yammer interface, or create a SharePoint site through the SharePoint interface. But we monitor and work out when a new group has been created, and we do some things off the back of that. And that might be, depending on what your governance model is, might be removing access so that they can't invite other people until they have completed some additional governance and agreed to a code of conduct. It might be that we set up some default templates for them. It might be that we apply a naming policy or convention. So this business process, we've got a workflow that sends out a notification to the person who's requesting them. It can be via email, or it could actually be within Teams itself. We ask them to fill out a Power App and gather some additional information, and we remind them if they haven't done that. When they've done that, then we apply some additional policy to the team, and we reinstate their access. This way, we've got a list of additional metadata that we can capture as well. So this doesn't block staff from actually doing something up front, but it enables you to govern the platform, to understand what teams have been created and why, to make sure that you have multiple owners, to make sure owners are aware of the responsibility that they have, and potentially to apply things like retention and classification and life cycle and enable or disable guest access. So think carefully about your team creation process. Think carefully about whether you actually need to stop it or not, whether you need to have an alternate mechanism, or if you can enable the out-of-the-box process but introduce some governance through back-end processes like this. This, as I said, will vary depending on the organisational requirements that you have and your compliance needs. The second key topic that we really often see a lot is, once a team's been created, how do I make sure that content has been protected? Or sometimes during that creation process, we want to ask questions along these lines as well. So I think a number of different configuration options that are available within Teams to manage this. And Teams is full of different settings and policies. So a couple of the settings and policies that you can care about include whether you want to enable anonymous users and guest users to access a channel or a meeting. We configure this at different levels. Depending on the business process that you go through, you can configure guest access on a team or channel basis. So, on a team basis. So at a tenant level, enable guest access, or on per team level. And so you may have your default setup that guest access is not enabled, but that it can be enabled for certain teams where you want to encourage cross-organisation work. Things like projects where you're working with a vendor or with a partner, set up that team to enable guest access to that team only, so then you can collaborate externally with that team. Once you've done that though, there are then additional policies that are available, and this screen is showing a couple of the settings that are available for meetings. One setting that you may like to tweak, depending on what your organisational requirements are, is the setting around anonymous access. This is a really great setting for making it very easy for people to access Teams meetings, but maybe that you want to try to restrict and control a bit more effectively who can access meetings. So when a meeting invite goes out, do you require users to be able to log in and be authenticated to join the meeting or not? Then there are policies that are available, and the Teams policies can be set on a per team level or across the whole tenant. Some Teams meeting policies that you may like to configure include things like screen sharing. If you have a lot of sensitive data, or you know that a particular team is being set up to discuss particularly sensitive conversations and material, you may like to restrict screen sharing. You may also like to restrict some of the additional things like allowing external participants to control or to share PowerPoints or whiteboards. And so these are all controlled through the meeting policy settings. And meeting policies can be applied, as I said, across the whole tenant or specific areas of specific teams. So you can decide based on the type of team that you've got set up, then you can apply different settings and policies. May also like to consider mobile access management and controlling adding additional governance to the way in which people can access Teams via mobile devices. And so if you've got a lot of sensitive data, then you probably want to consider enabling mobile access management. And there's a wealth of different policies that are available in Azure to control this, including enforcing PIN, enabling remote wipe, restricting copy and paste and download and save as, and printing and encrypting data on mobile devices. It's all available through the Azure portal. So there's a couple of settings that are available in different areas of the Teams governance suite. We've got some team settings that apply to meetings. We've got some settings from Azure Information Protection and Intune that apply to mobile access. We can also look at data retention and classification and retention policies. And this is a really interesting and quite complicated picture because, as I said at the outset, Teams makes use of the whole of the Office 365 suite. So we've got the Teams client, we've got chats, we've got documents, we've got meetings, we've got calls, we've got personal files, we've got channel messages, we've got wikis. That data is all stored in different services. So where we apply classification and data loss prevention depends on what sort of things that we want to control. We want to avoid data being leaked or data being lost from our organisation. We want to protect our sensitive data. We can do that by applying classification and retention policies in lots of different locations. We want to manage and maintain one-on-one chats. We have to apply that classification to user mailboxes because those chats are stored in the user mailbox. So we can do that on a per user basis. we want to do to apply retention to group conversations, then those are stored in the group mailbox, and we can apply retention in the group mailbox. We want to apply classification to documents. Those are stored in the SharePoint team site if those documents are stored in a chat in a team, or if they are shared in a one-on-one chat, they're stored in OneDrive for Business. So we have to apply data loss prevention and classification to those locations, retention to those locations. So it's a pretty complicated picture. It's important to sort of really define this based on what are we trying to control, and to know that there are controls available, they're just configured in lots of different locations. Retention policies, as I said, controlled lots of different locations. Those are controlled through the Security and Compliance Centre. And we can see here I've got a screenshot of the various different options that are available. One thing that's interesting for teams and is really important to consider as part of your governance process is where you will apply classification and retention. Teams channel messages are stored in the, as I said, in the group mailbox, and so that means that you can apply retention based on a team basis. And so you can choose which teams have classification applied to them and retention applied to them, and which teams are excluded on a team basis. But one-on-one chats are stored in the individual mailboxes, and so that means that we apply them on a user level. So we can decide whether particular users should have retention applied to them. So when we think about users leaving the organisation, we may like to retain their chats, and so we can apply that policy to people that have left the organisation to retain their chats. One advanced scenario which we've seen across a number of organisations is those control mechanisms are not particularly granular. So it's possible to extend upon that and provide additional functionality. And so one example is build a bot or an application which we can install into Teams to enable us to pick up some of the history from Teams, capture that, and convert and move it across to retain it in our record management system or in another location where it can be stored. Another question that we see very often when an organisation hasn't put into place heaps of governance is how do we avoid overwhelming staff with notifications? We've got a number of different options again for managing this. We can use team settings or messaging policies or a combination of both to really improve this situation. And a couple of policies which I want to call out here are restricting who can mention large groups. We often see that large groups, particularly all company or company-wide groups, become quite noisy. People tagging other members of the group or tagging the channel or the team and causing everybody in the team or channel to have a notification. With large groups, this creates a lot of noise. So we do recommend with large groups, any group that's over sort of 20 or 40 people, to consider whether you want to restrict in the team settings, some of these settings here, to restrict who can @mention the team or who can @mention the channel. That's something that a team owner can do, and that's something you might like to build into your team ownership documents. Then we've got messaging policies that can be applied across the whole organisation or on a per team level. And so they include things like determining who can send urgent messages, which create priority notifications. And we certainly recommend that you consider whether this should be turned on or restricted. We'd also encourage a bit of change management here. There's a really great feature in the Teams mobile application or applications that enable staff to control their own notifications and when they get those. And one great feature, which is available through many of the Microsoft applications, not just Teams, but also Outlook in particular, is quiet hours. And you should really build this into your change management and education process to encourage staff to turn on quiet hours so that they don't get notifications outside of hours. You can see here that's a per user setting that they can apply into their teams. Oops. Another setting to consider, I've got two more topics here. One is naming policies. Really important, I think, to avoid cases of mistaken identity and maintain some control over the way in which your groups are referred to. We see this really vary between different organisations. Some organisations really want to make sure that groups are identified by the department from which they've come from. Other organisations are quite happy to, to maintain and manage this through governance and education. But there's a really great feature available through Azure Active Directory in the Office 365 group settings, if you've got Azure Active Directory P1, that you can enforce a group naming policy. And you can use tokens based on the user's information. So you inject their division name or their business unit into the name of the group. This can really help to avoid some cases of mistaken identity, such as one example I heard from an education organisation, a higher education university, who had a group that was created called Scholarships. And it was a back-end office team that was responsible for administering some of the business process around scholarships, but not actually processing scholarship applications. But students started emailing through their scholarship applications to this group, and because it created an email address called scholarships at this organisation. If we'd used a naming policy in that instance, that would have been avoided because it wouldn't have created that email address. Finally, the sort of last thing I think is really worth mentioning is archiving and retention. How do we monitor? We need to monitor teams to make sure that our team's environment doesn't sprawl out of control. We really want to make sure that we are keeping track of what's happening. And there are some tools to do this, some hooks within Office 365 that enable to do this, and also some great third-party applications. We do a lot of this using Power Automate as well, building processes with our customers that automate some of their governance. And a lot of the things that we look for are these sorts of things. Inactive teams, teams that have fewer than 2 owners, teams that have lots of users, and that's when we can start to introduce some of those additional features around naming convention, about at mentions and control around notifications, the naming conventions, etc. But one of the things that's really critical is to tidy up teams that are becoming inactive and teams that have passed their use by date, and monitoring for that and making sure that we can archive and delete content. One thing to mention here is there's a range of different retention policies that we mentioned before, and these retention policies work pretty effectively to retain content whilst removing teams from search and from the user interface. They can be recovered, and if you've got a legal requirement to maintain that data, it's all accessible through the e-discovery portal, but they don't clutter up the team's interface and they don't pollute search because that documentation is no longer relevant. But there's a whole wealth of stuff that needs to be thought about when we're archiving teams, because Teams isn't just Teams, it's also Planner, Forms, Outlook, Power BI, Project, Videos, Stream, Power Automate. And so not all of those things are necessarily sucked into retention, and retaining some of those things can prevent deletion. And in particular, putting a retention policy on SharePoint can prevent Teams from being deleted. Teams can be archived, but not necessarily deleted. So thinking about very carefully how all of those things overlap and interact is very important when we think about our archiving process. Okay, that was a whirlwind going through just some of the features, and there are many, many, many more features, but I think important for us to just consider there's lots of features that are in the Office 365 area across Microsoft 365, tenant configuration, Azure Active Directory, Office 365 group settings. Then there are lots of settings within Teams that enable us to change the behavior within Teams across things like the who can do what within Teams chat, what the meeting setup is by default, what owners can do, etc. And then there are settings that sit within the security and compliance section of Office 365 and allow you to apply retention and data loss prevention and classification. Then there is a human element to it as well, making sure that we govern the way we train our users to use Teams effectively, that we train them about what they can do and can't do, and that we help them to use Teams effectively. So with that in mind, let's flick over and take a look at the results from our second survey question. And Claudia, do you want to put the results up?
Here's the results. So it looks like most people have started planning and a governance approach, but don't have one yet. But it's a mixed bag again. Some people don't have any governance approach yet, and there are others that do have one, but it hasn't been designed with the business, which certainly something that is you know, I guess common and we see a lot of. So very interesting mix of results there. Cool. Last question for the session today. we're keen to know what your biggest people challenge is. So in a moment, the question will be up again on Mentimeter. So if you go to menti.com and type in the code on the screen, you'll be able to answer that last question. What is your biggest people challenge? You can pick as many as relevant there too. Cool, so want to switch now to talking about implementing governance. So we've talked about kind of the why and the bigger picture. Stephen has given some amazing insights into the common pitfalls and the areas that people look at when they're implementing or kind of planning the configuration of Microsoft Teams in relation to all of the other tools within Microsoft 365. Now, what does that mean from an implementation perspective? So again, going back to this, I guess, concept of people plus technology, for you to achieve new ways of working, for you to achieve really great value in your investment in Microsoft 365, you really need to be thinking about those two levers working together as one. So from the IT configuration and automation side, thinking about defining roles and responsibilities. So who do you need to get involved? Who are your key stakeholders from an IT perspective that should be part of this? Thinking about the application of security controls, process automation, information management, and sprawl. Sprawl is a really interesting one, and one of my colleagues at Engage Squared, I think, makes a really good point that sprawl, within your environment is so much better than sprawl outside of your environment. People will find ways to get things done. So if you put too many barriers in front of them, they'll use technology that you haven't sanctioned to get their work done. So that's a really big one. Triage and assessment of new feature releases, and also technical break fix, and also plan maintenance. So they're all the things that you need to be thinking about from a technical perspective. From a business and people side, that's where change management comes in. So when we talk about change management, there's really two components to it. One, that when you're planning your initial governance model, you need to be working with your business, with key stakeholders across the business to go co-design what that looks like. So it's all well and good for an IT person to go into the admin center and to toggle things on and off, but that can have real impact on productivity and collaboration. So making sure that whatever you're enabling or disabling makes sense for the way that people are working. So applying those business rules and creating those policies with the business. When you're ready to implement, communication's really key. Communicating the business reason for this change. So we've gone into lockdown, we're all working remotely from home. We're going to use something like Microsoft Teams as our main platform for collaboration and communication. This will mean X, Y, Z. More secure data, easier for you to attend meetings, easier for you to collaborate and get all the information you need in one place. Upskilling staff on how to use the technology. So that's a really key one. It's, one thing to kind of tell them this is really great, but something as disruptive or as different as Microsoft Teams really does need training and coaching. So meeting people where they're at in their journey, if they're really new to Teams, giving them that basic 101 training, and then over time, building on that and going on the journey with them, identifying more high value use cases where they could be using Microsoft Teams to achieve more impact. At the end of the day, no one actually really cares about the technology. It's about making sure that you can do your job, right? We're all employed to do a job. So we want to create impact and we want to achieve great outcomes. Managing pockets of resistance. So really natural that you won't have everyone in your organization super keen on using technology, and in particular Microsoft Teams. It can be quite polarizing in some organizations. So making sure that you have the right controls in place and the right information in place to look at your usage analytics, for example, to see where there might be underutilization of Microsoft Teams. That could be a sign that potentially they're using something else that isn't sanctioned, and working with the business to resolve that. Another really key thing is evergreen management. So we want to think about giving people, or kind of I guess, bringing them on that journey or on that ride with you and getting them to contribute to ongoing testing and implementation of new feature releases. I'll talk about Evergreen on the next slide and what that means in a moment from a change velocity perspective, but really key that governance is not something that you do once and then stop. There will be ongoing management that you'll need to do, and it's really important to bring the business on that journey with you. Lastly, measure ongoing usage and adoption. So make sure that you've got KPIs that you've set in place to track the success of your initiative. So that's really key to make sure that you can have a pulse check at different stages to make sure that you're tracking along as you'd expect. So this diagram is just showing that, one, you've got that implementation and support. So when you're initially planning, make sure you engage the business in that. And then once you've actually set your governance model in place, keep them engaged with IT. Don't stop talking. It should be a continuous cycle of communication. By the way, you might see a little child come behind me. I've got little kids at home. Hopefully they don't scream, but FYI, I'm sure a few parents on the call can relate. So Evergreen change intensity. So I mentioned just before the fact that there's going to be constant changes and new updates to the platform. Earlier this year, pre-COVID, we worked with a large insurance company to help them understand the change intensity and effort that would be associated with managing their growing cloud portfolio. So across their entire portfolio, we anticipated upwards of about 600 changes per year, each with varying levels of complexity and risk. So there are a few reasons for why they engaged us to help them with this piece of work. One, to help identify gaps in their current process for triaging and managing schedule changes. Second, they wanted to understand at a more granular level what's coming on the Microsoft 365 roadmap so that they could proactively plan from a technical and change perspective. And lastly, they wanted us to help put a business case together for what this would mean for resourcing their internal team. They were one of the few IT teams that recognised that the way that they'd set up their operations up till now isn't actually going to be suited to future needs and where technology is taking them. So a lot of IT teams are in the same boat as this particular customer in that they haven't really adapted their operating model to support SaaS technologies. So that means that things are falling through the cracks. There's often not enough dedicated resources within these teams, which is having a direct impact on how much value the business gets out of their investment in Microsoft 365. So we know that the number of plan changes is only going to continue to grow. So since doing this research at the start of the year, there have been more feature announcements added to Microsoft 365. The majority of these are really minor and don't require any action from IT or from the business. But it's really important to be proactively looking at what these are. So when you're thinking about your governance model, make sure that Evergreen management is brought into that discussion. Even for small changes that might, from a risk perspective, be green, might have minimal to no risk at all, there might be a really good productivity opportunity for you to capitalize on. So that second picture you're seeing on the screen is an opportunity score that we've developed for this particular client we were working with earlier in the year to help them identify how they could match the technology with identified use cases that they wanted to keep growing within their business. So for example, cross-channel posting in Teams, that was something that we wanted to let people leaders know about and internal comms teams know about so that they could leverage that feature to improve communications, reduce the number of emails, and move that kind of behavior into Teams. So even if you're thinking, you know, that's a great change and I don't need to do anything from an IT perspective, do think about how you can constantly be adding value by making sure that people are using all the features that they've got. So strategically driving adoption of existing features is going to be key. Awesome. So we'll quickly look at the results and then I'll hand back over to Steve to wrap up from today's call. So what is your, oh, I've got the wrong one. Bear with me 1 second. Oh, I need to change the screen I'm presenting. Bear with me, guys, sorry. Oh, it's not coming up. Strange. Steve, I might get you to quickly wrap up and then I'll bring up the result once I can get it.
Perfect. Very happy to. So that was a whirlwind. There is a lot in this topic and we've really only scraped the surface of the options that are available. But I think some key recommendations from us about what you should really consider when thinking about governance, and particularly when you're applying governance after having already launched teams. So in particular, I think Claudia's covered this really well, that governance requires great stakeholder management, particularly if you're introducing it after you've launched the new technology. Getting business leaders involved, making sure you've got technology leaders involved and champions involved in the decision-making process and the change management process is really critical, because otherwise you really risk getting in the way of the productivity of your staff. We've just started to get to grips with how to work remotely and in a hybrid environment, and tools like Teams have really helped to accelerate that. If you start to apply heavy governance on top of Teams now, then you really risk derailing that. The second point, which Claudia just covered, is that great governance needs to be ongoing. It's impossible to really apply governance in a way that does and just forget about it, because the platform's changing so quickly, our work environment's changing so quickly, and the content within your team's environment is changing so quickly that you really need to establish an ongoing process for managing that. Claudia mentioned in the previous slides that we really want to care about the way in which the Evergreen environment is happening and make sure that we've got some governance across that Evergreen environment. And really to be effective in that, you need to have a working group that is continuing to look at what's changing in the environment, continuing to monitor how people are using Teams, and to be able to quickly make decisions about when you will introduce new features, when you'll introduce new governance, when you'll change how the platform behaves, and map that across with business change processes as well, including training and education. Third is, don't block key business processes, manage them, and be reactive if you need to. So the example that I gave about the Teams creation workflow is a really good example, but there are many others where automation can really help with this. But it's critical that you don't get too much in the way of staff being productive. We train them up and we make sure that they are able to do things in an effective way within a couple of constraints that you need to think about. And finally, well, actually not finally, fourth point, protect your data, but there are lots of options to protect your data without compromising the user experience or limiting adoption. And we had some great questions about this in the chat, actually. Please feel free to ask more questions. But a great question about how we might do this for third-party apps. And there's lots of different great examples of how to control third-party apps. But think about that Microsoft have really created a framework within Teams and within Office 365 that allows you to protect your data without getting in the way of your staff's experience. And finally, automation is your friend. Either using Power Automate and automatically picking up on various different activities and managing those, or bringing in a third-party tool. And I mentioned some of those in the chat. There are lots of third-party governance tools, security tools, etc., that can help you with your governance process. But to get really great governance without compromising user experience, then automation really, really helps to facilitate this. Cool, so that's my conclusion. Claudia, how did you go with the last results? And we're just out of time, but we will stick around a little bit to answer questions at the end as well.
I got it. So 32% of people, the biggest challenge that they've got is people not having enough knowledge about Teams or M365 more broadly.
Cool, and that maps 100% to our experience with our customers, actually, that we've rolled teams out really quickly at a lot of organisations, and we've done our best to try to encourage and engage staff and explain to them what, how they can use it, how we want them to use it, what sorts of things we want them to do in teams and what we don't want them to do in teams. But it takes a long time to get that sort of technology change, and I think it's an ongoing conversation that we need to have, and there's always more room for additional education, additional training, and particularly training around governance, and governance to introduce some consistency in the way that we work within teams. All right, a couple of questions just at the end now. Before I answer them, please do feel free to stay in touch. As I said, we'll send out an email after we wrap up with the recording. But please feel free to get in contact if you've got challenges within your organisation around this, if you want to talk to us more, or if you've got follow-up questions, please do feel free to reach out. Claudia, maybe a question for you. In our experience, what's the most effective way to get engagement from staff in Teams features?
Oh, that is a great question. I would probably say it's that what's in it for me. So really making sure that you have an understanding of how your staff work and how the different staff in your organisation work, and then contextualising the use of something like Microsoft Teams to their job so that the penny really drops. They go, oh, okay, I can use it for that particular feature. Because Teams is such a broad piece of technology, it can overwhelm people. So really make sure that you contextualise that change and understand how they work. It's probably my top recommendation.
Great, thanks, Claudia. And last question, I may not be able to share an answer to this today, but some examples of KPIs about how we measure success, what we see as good use of Teams, how we track to see whether we're getting value from Teams.
That's another really good question. It does vary for every organisation in terms of what does good look like. KPIs that you should be looking at can be related to particular scenarios. So if we think about team collaboration as a scenario, looking at how many channel messages are being posted in Microsoft Teams, how many teams are being created, how many people are in those teams. So real metrics that you can get from the admin centre to track. And give yourself increased KPIs. So say, for example, if your Teams usage for channel messages is about 50% now, increasing that by 5% or 10% over the next 6 to 12 months to show that there's growth and that tool is being embedded is a great KPI to use. But don't just stop at quantitative measures. Make sure you look at qualitative measures as well. So if you can take advantage of any employee surveys that are already sent out, tacking on some questions that are technical related to collaboration and remote working, that's a really great avenue to take as well for measuring KPIs and adoption.
Great, well thanks Claudia, and I think that is all of the questions that we've had today. So thank you again everybody for joining. Really appreciate you coming along and giving up some of your Thursday to join us to talk about this topic. As I said, please do feel free to stay in touch and look out for our email and the recording coming out. Feel free to share it with your colleagues and continue the conversation about how we can continue to apply governance in Teams without damaging the adoption that we've seen. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day.